It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. The Prime Minister says he has a plan for change. So how can we judge whether he's succeeded or not?
Today we publish new milestones, measurable milestones, that will also give the British people the power to hold our feet to the fire.
But Keir Starmer's milestones don't include defence. Are we ready for a more dangerous world?
We are at the dawn of a third nuclear age, which is altogether more complex.
Let me be crystal clear. This government is ending the two-child cap, and in doing so will lift over 15,000 Scottish children out of poverty.
And that's the promise for Scotland, but how will they do it? With me today, Labour MP Chris Curtis, Conservative MP Neil Hudson, Lib Dem MP Helen Morgan and political strategist and commentator Jo Tanner. This is Politics Live. Hello. Let's start with this headline in the Daily Mail. Decline in number of retailers accepting cash is hurting vulnerable people who rely on it to budget. That's the warning from charities, and the Treasury Select Committee has also been hearing evidence to see if rules are needed to ensure cash is accepted. What do you think, starting with you, Chris? Should shops be forced to accept cash?
Well, I'm not sure that forcing businesses is necessarily the right direction. I haven't read the report that we've seen from the charities or the Treasury Select Committee yet. But certainly I think, look, we need to make sure that everybody has access to cash. That's why we're rolling out banking hubs right across the country. And I also think it's really important that most shops continue to accept it.
I mean, have you heard from any constituents that this is a problem? I mean, charities told the committee numerous groups were excluded from essential services and community venues that had started to refuse cash.
Yeah, no, and I've spotted it happen across my patch as well, and I think it's really important. I'm not always convinced that mandatory government intervention is always the best direction, but certainly I think that shops should be continuing to accept cash.
I mean, asking them to continue to do so is one thing. Should they be forced to accept cash to make sure no one is excluded?
I think this is deeply concerning. There are many, many people in society, Jo, that still rely on using cash every day. Many vulnerable people, many elderly people that don't do online banking, and there's real worries in some communities as well about online fraud. So I think it's so important that people have access to services. And this is something both for urban areas but also rural areas. So I think we must make sure that people can still use cash on a day-to-day basis.
So you'd like the law changed? You'd like to see it mandated?
I think obviously we don't want to have overburdensome on businesses, but I think it's so important in society that all people who want to still use cash can do so.
Right. I mean, clearly, lots of banks have shut their offices in town centres, so getting cash is not as easy as it used to be. Do you think it should be enforced?
Well, I think people do need access to cash. So my constituency of North Shropshire obviously has an older population, a very rural population, and it causes real concern when banks go from the high street, because so many people use it for budgeting, particularly when there's been a cost of living crisis. There are older people worrying about how they're going to make ends meet this winter with loss of their winter fuel payment. So they really like to use cash to budget. And I think we also ought to think about other groups of vulnerable people. For example, there might be people who are being coerced at home who might want to use cash for the purposes of their own privacy. So I think we should absolutely be encouraging shops to accept cash. Should we be imposing another regulatory burden on them? I'm not sure. I don't think we should. But I think...
Well, then how do you do it, really?
Well, because it's, you know, there are transaction charges associated with using contactless and cards. So for a lot of businesses want to use cash.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing for them to be encouraged to welcome people who are paying by cash.
I mean, does it feel like a retrograde step to sort of go back to the idea of cash being king, in the sense that more people might want to use it when we've gone down this contactless route for quite a long time?
It's really odd. I mean,
Yeah.
you're getting a lot of taxis in London, for example.
Yeah.
They were all forced to put machines into their taxis that they didn't want. And many times you would get into a taxi in London and they would say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, the machine's not working. I can only take cash." And you'd expect to be able to pay by card. And you know, there are charges that are associated with those transactions that those taxi drivers would complain a lot about losing money. But, you know, the public will vote with their feet. They will not want to go into certain shops if they can't pay in cash and they want to, there will be, I'm sure, people that will turn away from businesses that will say, we're not accepting cash, if you are one of those people that worries. I mean, we've had, you know, massive issues with cyber attacks and businesses that are sort of taken out, payment systems that are taken out, banking apps go down all the time. So the risk that even those businesses that might be going in that direction may end up harming their own firms because there will be times they simply can't process a transaction. You know, it's a risky position for the businesses themselves. I also feel a little bit sad that, you know, there are young people that want to get jobs, and it was always one of those things of having to sort of count the money out the till, and some of those like sort of softer skills that we need people to have. So I think I can't see a situation where government will get into legislating. They're not exactly in businesses' best books at the moment, given what they've done recently with the budget. So perhaps this isn't a territory they want to go into.
Well, talking of which, we've had since the election 5 missions, 6 first steps, and today the Prime Minister has set out 6 measurable milestones in a major speech to a gathered audience in Buckinghamshire. Let's just have a listen to what he had to say.
Our plan for change is the most ambitious and credible programme for government in a generation. And we embrace the risk that comes with it. Because if there was no jeopardy, if there was no resistance, no blockages or impediments for us to remove, then as sure as night follows day, that would be a sign that we're not serious about delivering change. And I will never do that. The mandate was for change, and change is what we will deliver.
Those measurable milestones are raising real household disposable income, ensuring 75% of children are school-ready by reception year, recruiting 13,000 police officers, special constables and PCSOs, building 1.5 million homes, that will be familiar, decarbonising the electricity grid by 2030 and treating 92% of NHS patients within 18 weeks of referral. Well, let's get some reaction and analysis of where the public are in terms of the government after 5 months and talk to Scarlett Maguire, director at the polling company JL Partners. Hello to you, Scarlett. What do the public think of this government broadly?
The public opinion backdrop to Labour Party, I think, makes a quite grim reading for them at the moment. I wouldn't pay too much attention to voting intention polls, even though they don't look very good. But most importantly, for approval ratings of Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, his top team, and then the government's handling of issues, it's all looking pretty bad for the government.
Particularly in the response to the budget, because we've seen anger from farmers, pensioners and business. Has that been a particular point at which their view of the government has diminished?
I actually think it was something earlier on in Keir Starmer's premiership than that. I think the defining feature of this government so far in terms of the negative public opinion backlash towards it was the winter fuel cut that happened in the summer soon after they won the general election. Has not really recovered since then, and we know that's the thing that has stuck out most in people's mind. They talk about a big fiscal event. It was still the winter fuel cut payment rather than the measures announced in the budget. I think there has been some backlash to that, things like the national insurance rise, but more importantly, it's been the winter fuel cut payment, I think, that has provoked this sort of reaction.
And in terms then of this relaunch, reset, update, you can insert whichever word you like, do you think it will move the dial for the government?
I don't think it necessarily will. We'll have to wait and see to see in a few weeks' time what has sunk in with the public. But I think the problem is, at the moment, each time you get, I know they don't want to call it a reset, but whatever you want to call it, each time you do one of these things, I think it's diminishing returns with the public. They are tuning out more and more. They're not minded to listen to what politicians say at the moment anyway, and we've had a fair few of these already.
Chris, do you want to respond?
I used to do Scarlett's job.
Yes, that's one response, Chris.
So I take a look. I mean, the polling also shows that there's incredibly popular things that we've done as well, whether that's the dramatic rise that we've managed to put into the national minimum wage, whether that's setting up GB Energy so we can be investing in clean energy here in the UK as well. But there's also a more fundamental point, which is, as Scarlett will know, if you look all around the world, the biggest driver of whether a government gets re-elected is, after 5 years, have people got more money in their pocket? Are they feeling better off and richer? And sometimes you have to make difficult decisions that create a bumpy ride along the way in order to reach that point. But as the Prime Minister said, back out in his speech today, the most important mission of this government is, after 14 years basically stagnant wage growth, we need to start putting more money into people's pockets across their country so they can afford that holiday a year that maybe they're struggling to afford at the moment, so they can afford to take their family out for a nice dinner from time to time, because that's what people have lost over the last decade, and it's one of the things that this government is determined to bring back.
Neil, what do you say?
I think it's deeply disappointing. We're 5 months into this new government and we've had yet another reboot, rewiring, etc. It sounds like it's what's happening to my old laptop. And I think what this government needs is actually a complete change of the hard drive.
On that, sorry,
the Prime Minister's podium, it talked about change.
I'll let you come back. But what do you mean, a change of the hard drive? What is it that you would do differently? Because Kemi Badenoch, on one issue, for example, hasn't pledged to reverse the increases in national insurance contributions to employers.
What's very important is that the Prime Minister put on his podium change, and actually I think the government needs to change tack now. In your intro, you talked about some of the things that they have done that really are not working well, and the evidence suggests that these are going to be deeply damaging to our country in terms of the winter fuel cuts for pensioners, the jobs tax, and also the horrific and heartless farm tax that's actually going to put many, many family farms out of business. So I'm a vet by background, and when you are treating an animal, you take diagnostic tests, and sometimes things change, and you actually have to be prepared to change course. Strength in leadership comes if they say, look, we've made some mistakes, we will reverse on some of these decisions and actually reverse this jobs tax, reverse the winter fuel cut, and reverse the farm tax.
But Kemi Badenoch is not pledging to reverse what you say is a deeply unpopular
We had a very clear vote in Parliament yesterday on the farm tax that we're going to reverse that. So I think when you've made the wrong decision, you've got to actually put your hand up and say, this is going to deeply hurt the country and hurt vulnerable people, pensioners up and down the land, family farms, and actually people trying to hire people. Businesses are going to really struggle.
Sure,
so
I can hear you loud and clear on the changes to inheritance tax for farms, or some farms certainly, but not on the NIC. So I can't hear you doing anything different. But
we had clear votes on that yesterday, on their national insurance yesterday.
But to go back,
in our opposition debate yesterday, we were talking about the national insurance rises.
Isn't it a hostage to fortune to set out another load of targets? Because one of the things that voters felt was delivery was lacking under the last Conservative government. They didn't meet their targets. So why have another set of targets that you may or may not reach?
Because there's three things that I think we're trying to do in the speech today. The first of which is, look, we've got these big missions, they're really important, but they're quite big, and it's talking about a decade of national renewal. Actually, we know that voters out there in the country need this change that we've been talking about to be felt in their lives, and we've been setting out these milestones of areas where we know it's going to be felt in their lives, whether that's raising income standards or making sure that people can get appointments in the NHS. That's one big element of what we're doing today. The second is actually what you just talked about, accountability. It's very important that voters can turn around to us in 5 years' time and see whether we've succeeded or failed on what we're trying to do, just like anybody else in any other job across the country.
Does the public have a role in this themselves?
Yeah, I think they do. I think there's a couple of things, like having a lectern that says change when you've just been in for a few months seems a bit odd. It should have said delivery or something else. It doesn't feel like the right message. And I think the things like, let's have a police officer's number that you can all call. Great. I'm not sure how that works with the workers' rights bill. That means you don't contact people out of hours, but we'll figure that one out later. Don't want it to be contrary to any other legislation. So that there is an element for the public about what do we do to help this process. And I think this sort of number, having 75% of this or 82% of that, what about the ones that are left off? And how do we... I think there is a reset. If you were going to do a reset, I think the reset ought to have been, look, you have had 14 years and you've not been happy and you were let down by the government. We are going to do our bit. We need you to do your bit. And that means almost a new contract with the public. And I think it's about ensuring that the public recognise that they need to be part of the process. They need to help with, whether it's at local level reporting on crime, whether it's not feeling like, well, there's no point because no one listens anyway. We need the public to still be as demanding as they were and not just go, well, it's all going to happen in a few years' time. We sit back. We need to make sure people feel invested still. And I think the apathy bit is a really big problem that the government need to deal with.
What do you think of that? Does the public need to reset its expectations?
I don't think it needs to reset its expectations. I think it needs to see actual delivery on the ground. So, for example, 13,000 police officers is very abstract. What people want to see when they walk around Oswald Street and there's some antisocial behaviour going on is a police officer or a community support officer on the street in Oswald Street, preventing that from happening in the first place. They want to feel like the exorbitant taxes they're paying, with highest ever taxes under the Conservative government, the tax burden has increased even more in the last budget. They want to see some reward for that burden. But I think they also want to see politicians deliver, and they want to see some fairness in politics. And I think we would say we need to reform the way that we vote, the way that we deliver politicians into and deal with electoral reform, which Parliament also voted for this week.
But what do you think directly of that new social contract? Let's call it that. That's a phrase that's been used time immemorial, but that does need a reset.
But I think people need to have trust that it's going to deliver, don't they? Because at the moment, they feel like everything's broken.
That's what Keir Starmer could have done today. Yeah. He could have been saying, to your point, yes, if you report the crime, that's fine. But what you don't want is an automated message that comes back saying, we're not going to do anything with this. Yeah. We need to make sure that when people do engage, that then there is something going to happen with what happens with their information or their effort.
I agree with that. Can I just come back to that point on trust and Jo, what you said about the contract as well? What the Labour government has done, when you make manifesto promises, what this government has done already is go back on promises. They said they weren't going to put up taxes. They said they weren't going to change inheritance tax for farmers. We had tens of thousands of farmers marching through Whitehall. That shows that they feel so strongly that they were lied to, and that's what, in terms of the contract, it's got to be.
But the Conservatives have been guilty of that as well. The Conservative trade deals led the farmers to bring their tractors to Whitehall as well, because they totally undermined the standards that farmers expect.
Well, no, I have to disagree. That I speak as a veterinary surgeon. We upheld our animal welfare standards.
We upheld our own.
The food that's coming in is not undermining our animal welfare standards.
But there were protests.
We were clear on
that. There were protests, and farmers felt let down. Whatever the truth, they did feel let down. So it was exactly the same. You're saying that you're going to learn the lessons in terms of delivery, or you're going to try and deliver. What do you say about making it more tangible for people to actually recognise some of the things that are set out in these milestones? It's interesting that the fastest growing economy in the G7, not very tangible to everyone's daily lives, has gone. But it's gone. It's not in these milestones. And so you're trying to make it more tangible. So an admission that actually those initial missions and 5 steps didn't resonate.
No, well, I mean, on the missions are still incredibly important because they are there to allow us to deliver. So if you take fastest growth in the G7, for example, if we'd grown as fast as our comparable countries over the last 10 years, there'd be £5,000 more in the pay packets of working people across this country and 50 billion more for our public services. So you need to do that in order to achieve these things. But we need to make sure that economic growth actually delivers for working people across this country, and that is the milestone we know we're going to be judged by, and the Prime Minister set out today.
But don't you feel incredibly sorry for, and I'd say this with great respect, but I feel really sorry for Labour MPs that have now got missions and milestones and pillars, because you lot will struggle to remember them all and be able to coherently repeat them and talk about them. How on earth is the public going to understand what this government are going to do?
It's strong on alliteration, but not much else.
It's not just about the words in the missions, though. It's about how it's felt out there in the country. And the third bit I was going to talk about earlier is there was a really important speech in the Prime Minister's, really important line in the Prime Minister's speech today, which was he wants this to land with a thud on right across Whitehall, and desks right across Whitehall. And that's also really important, because what we're doing today is setting out that direction so that it delivers for people, because it's not just about the words, it's about people actually feeling it across the country.
Just before I go to you, Helen, let's just listen to that part of Keir Starmer's speech, because it was striking.
I don't think there's a swamp to be drained here. But I do think that too many people in Whitehall are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline.
Are you finding them a block? Whitehall's a block on what you want to do? Are you surprised?
I think all of the systems right across this country are pretty bunged up after the last 14 years of failure. And we've got to clear all of the broken systems.
Government ministers at party conference were complaining that civil servants had a complete lack of vision and innovation. They were openly talking in the bars about the challenges. They all thought that the reality of governing is it's a lot more difficult. They all came in and thought all these great things we've talked about, we're going to make it happen. And actually, it's not as easy.
Are important.
Yeah.
That is why speeches like this are important.
But that's the truth of it, isn't it?
Because the way of unbunging the system, if that's the correct terminology, is to have speeches like this where the Prime Minister sets out the clear direction.
Jacob Rees-Mogg said, let's get everyone back to work. I'm going to go around and have a go at all the civil servants. And it didn't
he left notes on their desks. What do you make of that, though? It is interesting. Keir Starmer says at one point, and I paraphrase, we're going to throw down these milestones, this speech on every desk in Whitehall. We're throwing the gauntlet down to you. That does sort of sound like frustration.
It does sound like frustration, but I just think that, picking odd targets isn't going to fundamentally change how we deliver public services to people in this country. So, for example, let's take the NHS waiting list target. That's great. We want to see when NHS waiting lists come down. But most people can't get to see their GP when they phone up at 8 o'clock in the morning because we don't have enough GPs. And so you can deal with the way that Whitehall works, but unless you have enough GPs to provide those appointments for people to get to see them, those people aren't going to feel that they're any
And you're
better
right, because they're not even in that target.
Well, let me just put this back to Scarlett. If we rewind a little bit in this discussion, Scarlett, about the sort of contract with the public, about people's expectations, what do you find when you're asking the sorts of questions you do when measuring support for a government?
We find that trust in politicians is at a record low, and I think will, if nothing happens about that, continue to decline. It's been quite a prominent trend over the last couple of years. I think people were overwhelmingly voting for change, not just a change on the sorts of priorities outlined in Keir Starmer's missions today: the economy, health service, immigration. Even though that was absent from the milestones. Sorry, not missions. It is quite hard to remember. But even though that was absent, yes, they're looking for delivery on those things, but actually they are fed up, I think, of being told one thing and then another happening, but they're also quite fed up of platitudes, and I think that's a very difficult line for someone like Keir Starmer to walk.
Are the public or the people you speak to, Scarlett, ready to hear the hard truths, as governments often call them, in terms of, yes, we want to improve public services, but that might mean taxes having to go up or spending being cut in other areas? I mean, are those the sorts of things people are expecting or accept they need to hear?
I think there's always a certain amount of challenge when it comes to public opinion because public are quite fond of cakeism. I mean, that's natural. You can want lots of things that appear to be quite contradictory, and they don't, devote all their time thinking in nitty-gritty policy terms about how to square many of these circles. But I do think there is an appetite for people to say, yes, this is hard, and outline the ways in which it is hard. But there also is even more of an appetite to actually hear what's going to be done about it. And I think that's still the missing piece when it comes to public that we're talking to in focus groups, in our polls. That's what they're still after.
Jo?
There's a phrase in communications which we talk about storytelling. And I think the journey is the bit that's very absent from the conversation that's been happening. I'm sorry to say, I'm sure plenty of viewers before this programme will be out there, will have been watching the speech, but it's not going to be one of those, let's all stop and gather around the TV to see what's being said by the Prime Minister moment. And the reality with the missions and all of the effort the government is making, the storytelling is absent because we haven't seen as many government ministers around doing the media rounds, which does then create a vacuum. In terms of the mission and the mission boards, why have they not all had individual websites set up talking about what they're doing to get to those targets? Why have they not had the narrative being set out about what's being done more coherently? Because that's where you bring the public along with you, because they know you're not at the final point. No one wants to wait 4 years to see improvement, but they want to see the journey towards improvement.
Chris?
And I think it's lacking at the moment.
Chris?
I mean, Jo will know from her comms work as well, fantastic comms work that she does, that actually we talk a lot about comms, but the product is also important. Actually, the delivery is far more important than how we talk about the delivery. And what we need to do, more than anything else, is make sure there's more money going into people's pockets, make sure the NHS is recovering, and implement that plan that we've got in order for people's lives to be better. So we can talk about the comms a lot, but actually, that's the bit that's most important.
But part of the comms has been we're having all these consultations, and yet the targets are being set when the consultations are still ongoing about some of the areas that we've now set targets for. So I don't understand that as a coherent strategy, because surely you're diagnosing the problem, you're asking for the input on how to get there, Then you set the target on what you're going to do. But the target's been set before the problem and the potential solutions have been diagnosed. So there's a bit of a mismatch going on at the moment.
There's lots of things we're already putting in place in order to start achieving these targets. One of the really important targets today is to hit clean energy by 2030. We've got a plan in place, setting up GB Energy, already passed the legislation, so we can start investing in clean energy here in the UK, end our reliance on foreign oil and gas, and have more stable energy bills into the future.
All right, we're going to move on. Thank you very much, Scarlett Maguire. You heard Admiral Tony Radakin in the headlines talking about defence. It's a major issue, of course, with everything going on in the world, and one that Keir Starmer didn't include, defence, that is, as one of his measurable milestones. Now, that was despite Veterans Minister Alistair Khan's frank comments at the Royal United Services Institute defence think tank, in which he said that the entire British Army would be destroyed in 6 months to a year if engaged in a major conflict with the likes of Russia. You can see the BBC headline. Chris, the Labour government has said it will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, but not said when. It sounds like it should be more of a priority.
We've already put over £2 billion extra into our defence, and you'll be hearing more in the new year about our plan to get that up to 2.5% and the timeframes in order to do so. We're not going to make promises and just waffle on about it. The last Tory government kept talking about 2.5% and never reached it. The last time we reached it was under the last Labour government, and this Labour government is committing to hitting that target again.
Well, that's true.
I've got a lot of respect for the Veterans Minister, a senior military officer, and I think it's great when we have people like that in Parliament. We've got Tom Tugendhat on our side, we've got Dan Jarvis for Labour.
Well, being frank and honest.
But I'm deeply concerned when a senior minister says things like that actually we are living in dangerous times. To actually talk about potential capability and vulnerabilities, I don't think is the best way forward. On the 2.5%, we have been absolutely clear that by 2030, if we had been elected, we would have reached 2.5%.
How would you have paid for it?
I think our allies and our adversaries need to know that commitment so that the MOD can be planning in terms of replacing the munitions that we have given to Ukraine and actually talking about personnel issues to make sure that we are capable. But I don't necessarily think we should be making public statements to actually talk about where we're at in terms of our status.
Well, let's start with that. I'll come back to the funding.
Labour really must commit themselves to it because we need clarity in a dangerous world.
Right, but on that first point, do you think it was too frank from Alistair Khan's?
I haven't seen the speech, and I believe a lot of the report.
Well, he said the entire British Army would be destroyed in 6 months to a year if engaged in a major conflict with the likes of Russia.
I haven't seen the speech, but the point he makes is a point that this government makes a lot, which is, again, just how many of our systems are underfunded and broken after 14 years of Tory failure.
I mean, just briefly, how would you pay for it? Because you have committed to a timeline to reach 2.5% by 2030. But how would that have been paid for?
We've been very clear that we would make sure that we'd get there by 2030 if we'd been elected.
So you would have increased taxes or cut spending elsewhere.
Actually, coming back on to what the Minister said, it's important that our adversaries know that actually NATO fights together as well. So talking about the British Army in isolation, if heaven forbid something happened and British forces had to be deployed, we would be supported by our NATO allies. In the most recent Steadfast Defender exercise, there were 20,000 UK troops. We were the highest NATO troop in terms of European forces. So we are there, but we've got to make sure that we fund things moving forward so we are capable.
Do we need to raise defence spending faster?
I think what we need is a really clear roadmap of how we're going to get to the 2.5%, because we have somebody who has been weakly committed to NATO coming into the White House, who said some very alarming things about the situation in Ukraine. We've got the army that's at its smallest size since the Napoleonic era under the Conservatives. They made a commitment at a point in time where they knew they would never have to deliver it because they knew they were going to lose the general election. So I don't think we can really take that Conservative commitment seriously.
What we need to do now... Let us finish. In terms of European NATO troops in the most recent exercise.
I think what we need to do now is recognise that the world is a much more dangerous place. NATO is a much more unstable alliance, potentially. There is political turmoil on the continent in Europe as well. So it's up to us now to lead, and we need to see an urgent roadmap to get to that 2.5%.
I mean, one of the other issues that's mentioned by Alistair Cairns, but it's also been talked about by other members of the defence fraternity in this case, bolstering the reserves. I mean, is that something that should be actively discussed, how to do that in the event of some sort of conflict?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. There's the first point about we're getting into conflicts, maybe not directly, but we've, you know, in terms of supplying arms and things in Ukraine. So there's a narrative. We're getting involved, but then we also aren't necessarily doing all the planning. On reservists, the issue there is, you know, for years we haven't really talked up our armed forces. We've given them equipment that didn't work with other bits of equipment, and it sort of felt like it's been a bit of a secondary service, a Cinderella service in some ways, in terms of how it's been looked after. That probably isn't fostering a particularly patriotic or sort of interest in the services more generally. And one of the first access points would be something like the reserves.
Right.
So I think there is an argument.
But in terms of the role of the public that you were talking about, do they need to lean into this idea as well?
Well, it was interesting that Rishi Sunak came out with that slightly bonkers sort of plan in the election around military service and voluntary service. It was all a bit, they didn't really know really what they were saying, but it was obviously something they dreamt up, sounded clever. But it did start a debate about whether it would be good to have more people looking at undertaking some form of service. And potentially, I think, you know, in the same way we encourage people to be school governors or other parts of civic duty, is it that we should be sort of rebranding and marketing a bit more the reservists as an option for people, because it plays a really important role?
Was it a bonkers idea by Rishi Sunak in the election campaign?
I agree with Jo completely. We need to talk up our armed forces, both our regulars and our reservists, and we've got to support them. And this government has done that in terms, and we need to look forward, you know, whether we need to increase the reservists, whether we actually need to increase...
Do you think we do?
We need to look at that in terms of strategic reviews, in terms of regulars and reservists. But what the previous Conservative government did, we brought the military covenant into law to actually respect and look after our armed forces, and then when they leave the armed forces, we did things like recognising them in terms of the Veterans Rail Card and that sort of things. Yeah. We've got to support them. We've got to work on recruitment and retention. So in the last Parliament, we gave a 9.7% increase to the lowest ranks in the armed forces as well. But we've got to make sure that we talk them up. We are so lucky to have our reservists and our regulars, and we need to support them and moving forward.
What sort of plan do you think the government should present in terms of bolstering the reserves, getting more people to join up?
Yeah, and I think as well, the point that Jo just made, we need to talk about it more in defence, because it's not just about more money, just like with the National Health Service. It's also about making sure that money is effectively and efficiently spent for the defence of this country. That's why we're engaging in that defence review at the moment. I don't think review's a dirty word. It is important to make sure that money we put in, money we ask the taxpayer for, is being spent efficiently. That is going to look at that programme, including looking at reservist numbers in order to come up with a plan to make sure
you're
our
young.
country is safe.
Would you ever consider joining up to the reserves? If
yes.
it became, you would? Yeah.
Well, I think we just need to restore the troop numbers. We dropped 100,000 troops during the last government. We need to restore our army to that 100,000 number. And, you know, retention and attitudes in the army are really poor. You know, the housing has been poor, people feel undervalued. So we do need to talk them up, but we need to make them actually feel valued. You know, they need to live in a house that doesn't have a leaky roof and rats in the kitchen and all of those things that have caused this crisis in military retention. So we can talk about it, but you need to tangibly deliver for these things to have a material impact. Otherwise, people are going to lose trust in politicians because it's just a talking shop and it's not actually changing things on the ground.
All right, well, we're going to talk about the Scottish budget, which was delivered yesterday. Let me just show you this headline in the Herald: Scottish budget, SNP to mitigate two-child cap. As you know, there's been a lot of controversy and discussion about that two-child benefit cap and the limit on it. It was the biggest announcement in the budget yesterday. Let's talk to the Scottish Public Finance Minister, Ivan McKee. He joins us from Edinburgh. Hello to you. The headline says mitigate. I think Shona Robertson used the word scrap. How will you scrap the two-child benefits policy?
We'll do the same as we've done when we've mitigated other Westminster policies that we think shouldn't apply in Scotland, but are still reserved. We did that with the bedroom tax and continue to do that, and with other measures. and what we will do is work with DWP to get the data we require so we can identify the individual families involved, and through Social Security Scotland, our agency that delivers a number of benefits in Scotland, many of which aren't available in the rest of the UK, will deliver a benefit for those families, like we are intending to do also with the winter fuel payment, which we have reinstated as universal benefit in Scotland from next year.
How much will it cost to mitigate, as you say, this two-child benefits cap?
The number is just over £100 million, so we're working out the final details on that. I believe it affects about 26,000 families, but as I say, we need to get the final data from DWP so we can clarify the exact number.
Will you say
it's just north of £100 million?
Right, just north of £100 million, because actually we've sort of got figures here from the Institute for Fiscal Studies that says the annual cost would be between £200 and £300 million and would likely require cuts to some other areas of spending or tax rises. So which will it be?
We don't recognise that number, but as I say, we're having to work through the details of that. It's the Scottish Fiscal Commission in Scotland that will produce the final number on that, and we hope to get that back from them shortly.
I'm sorry to be pedantic, but the Scottish Fiscal Commission says it is around £200 million.
They say that is the case for, I believe, 29-30, fiscal year 29-30, not for the year we're implementing.
All right.
So we believe there's 26,000 families. The benefit of that to each child is about £3,500, and obviously then you do that calculation. It depends on exactly how many children are impacted.
It's still a significant amount of money. How will you pay for it?
Well, we've got the budget for that. We will roll that out as part of our budget for next year, for 26-27, through that process.
And will that be tax rises or cuts to other areas?
We believe that we've got the funds to be able to do that. So we balance our budget every year, unlike the UK government. We've done that now for 18 years now. Balanced our budget. We've got very, very limited borrowing powers. We need to make that work. We've been through a number of processes where, as identified, we have mitigated the bedroom tax. We've got the Scottish Child Payment in place, which allows 350,000 low-income family children to get an extra £26 a week in Scotland.
And you've made it a priority.
Isn't available anywhere else in the UK, and we will balance the budget next year as we're doing this year.
All right. Ivan McKee, you obviously are setting that out as a priority very clearly, and that was stated yesterday. But as you said at the beginning, it is a UK-wide policy imposed by the Department of Work and Pensions on welfare payments. We have a Labour MP here. What's your response to saying that the Scottish Government obviously want to work at Westminster, they want to mitigate this policy, they need your help? Or should you just scrap it all together?
It's good to see how much extra money has been able to go to the Scottish Government as a result of our recent budget. And, you know, we've had to make difficult decisions, but we've therefore given the Scottish Government that money that's allowing them, in using the full powers of devolution, which is fantastic, to make the decisions that they want to make based on what is best for Scotland. I actually don't think some of the decisions that they're making are the right ones, particularly the fact that people will still be waiting a year for NHS treatment. I don't think is the right decision or the right priority, given 1 in 6 Scots are on NHS waiting lists, but that's a decision for them, and they will live or die by it in the next Scottish elections.
Ivan McKee?
This very much misrepresents what's happening. We've got record funding of £21 billion going into the health service. We're further advanced in terms of social care and health integration in Scotland. The rest of the UK is catching up with us. We've got the best performing A&E department in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, and we're working very hard on waiting lists, which I think in the last data were lower in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. So we've absolutely got a focus on more funding going in. That funding has gone in, but we've also got a very clear focus on the reform agenda around about the health service. I'm working very hard with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and with other ministers to make sure we're delivering on that reform agenda. I had meetings this morning with local authorities and NHS boards to see how they can work more closely together to help be more efficient on the ground, and we're working very hard on waiting lists.
That all sounds great, except the spending watchdog Audit Scotland has said that the NHS in Scotland is unsustainable in its present state. Local authorities want more cash and autonomy, and the unions say education is threatened by a lack of teachers. So have you actually made the wrong choice in terms of your priority?
No, I don't think so. We've got, I think, about 20% more teachers per head of population in Scotland than there is across the rest of the UK, and they're paid significantly more. Starter teacher in Scotland gets paid about £6,000 more.
So why are the unions saying education in Scotland is threatened by a lack of teachers if they're so well paid? And
absolutely, those are the facts, right? The union can speak for themselves, and of course they're always going to argue for more money and more staff. But as I say, there's 20% more teachers per head of population in Scotland than there is in the rest of the UK.
Right,
so and if you look at on doctors and nurses, it's similar numbers. They're better paid in Scotland, nurses significantly so, and police officers, all of those public sector cohorts, frontline workers, there's around 20% more of them in Scotland.
All right, let me just get at some reaction.
So we've got our priorities right. We're focused on what's important.
Well,
delivery of the people
they're
of
your
Scotland.
priorities.
Child poverty.
They're your priorities. The public will judge whether they're the right ones or not. Neil Hudson, or a previous, I should say, Conservative government brought in the two-child benefit cap. Are you still supportive of it?
I think this is important that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are deciding their priorities. These are political choices, and actually they have made this choice. But then we should note that Scotland remains the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, and also that's
also their choice.
Yes, it is that it's their choice. The Scottish Government are talking about trying to mitigate the effects of winter fuel. I know that Scottish Labour are wanting to do the same. That's not going to do anything for this winter that we're in. But this is sending a strong message to Keir Starmer in London that the winter fuel policy is wrong. And you know, these policies are for the Scottish Government to decide what they do with the allocated block grant and make their decisions from there.
Right. I mean, they're doing
it's also, I think, important to note that in regards to that tax comment, that most people in Scotland pay less income tax than they would if they were in the rest of the UK. And we also have a significant number of benefits available in Scotland. For example, tuition fees for university students are still free in Scotland. Prescription charges are still free in Scotland. Council tax in Scotland, I think, is about £500 or £600
so there are the choices. Well, I mean, Ivan is right on that.
People
get a lot of benefits for that
I noticed
tax.
in the Scottish budget yesterday that actually the rural budget is being cut by 3.1%. So when actually farmers across the UK are struggling, in Scotland the budget's being cut.
Do you agree with the priorities, Helen, that have been set out by Ivan McKee on winter fuel payment for pensioners and also on this two-child benefit cap that the Labour government has said they're not going to scrap?
Well, I think when it comes to the Scottish budget, you know, if we look at Scotland, the SNP have been in power for 17 years. We think that Scotland needs a change of direction and a change of government. But if we look at the
issues that have just been raised, do you agree with them?
Well, we've put forward a lot of ideas into this budget, and we're pleased to see that they've listened to them. So we've seen, you know, better spending on social care, affordable homes, insulation, a lot of ideas put forward by the Liberal Democrats. I've got a huge list in front of me and I'm not going to read them out now. But I think, you know, the devil is in the detail of every single budget, as we've discovered with the recent Labour budget. So we'll be, you know, looking through this over the next few months.
Right. So, well, Ivan, you've inspiration from the Liberal Democrats for your policies. You can thank them.
We're working very closely with all parties in the Scottish Parliament. We, of course, are a minority government, and we will work with parties to get our budget through in February. And that process is working very well. We've taken some very constructive suggestions from other parties on their priorities, and they've been communicated in the budget yesterday.
Is it embarrassing, Chris, for you? These policies shine a light on disagreements within the Labour Party at Westminster, the parliamentary party, both on the winter fuel payment being cut and on this two-child benefit cap.
I think it, again, comes back to a fairly similar answer to what I gave you on the Defence Review. We have child poverty numbers which are, quite frankly, a disgrace. The number of kids, and it's robbing kids' futures from them and the opportunities to succeed, which they have an absolute right to have. But we've got limited government budgets, and we need to make sure that the interventions right across government to bring down that horrific child poverty number, just like we did under the last Labour government, we'll do it again. But we need to make sure those interventions are done efficiently in order to get the maximum bang for our buck. And that's why we've set up a child poverty task force working cross-government to work out what interventions.
That single policy, reversing that would have the biggest difference.
But they're looking at that alongside a wide range of things, and
so it might change. I mean, what do you make of the different priorities here from the Scottish Government on those two welfare issues?
It's probably a smart strategy from the SNP, because what they want to do is show that being in charge in Scotland, things happen differently, and therefore this is all part of the argument that that's what you would get with an independent Scotland. That's all part of the journey that they ultimately need to get onto, creating clear water between themselves and the rest of the UK, because they've been sort of mired in all these problems that have meant that it's been more about leadership and sort of corruption allegations and all sorts, rather than actually about what they're doing or what they can do. So it's a smart strategy. To your point earlier, Jo, you exactly said it's the public that will decide whether they feel better about what's happening, whether it's made the difference.
Ivan McKee, thank you very much for joining us today. It's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests here on Thursday. I'll be back on Monday with more Politics Live. Please join me then at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. But from all of us now, good afternoon.